going to be like the others. It wasn't just because it was piano class, either. Jamal loved music more than anything in the world, and the piano had always been his escape. When his fingers touched the keys, the world faded away, and it was just him and the music. But Jamal wasn't like most of the other kids in his class. He was one of the few black students in a school that was mostly white. Though he had friends, there were times when he felt out of place. It wasn't because of the way he looked or the way he spoke, it was the way others treated him. Jamal had learned to keep his head down, not to rock the boat. But the whispers, the stares, and the comments still stung. Some of the other kids were friendly, but others seemed to look at him like he didn't belong. It was especially hard when he was around teachers, many of whom didn't understand him. Mrs. Henderson was one of those teachers. She was strict, with a reputation for being hard on students, but Jamal always felt there was something more to it when it came to him. There was a coldness in the way she looked at him, something that wasn't there with the other students. Maybe it was because she didn't think much of him. Maybe she didn't think much of his kind, either. It wasn't that Mrs. Henderson ever said anything directly to Jamal, but he could tell by the way she treated him in class. She was the kind of teacher who demanded excellence, but Jamal always felt like she expected less from him, as if she didn't believe in his ability to succeed in the way she did for the other students. That feeling of doubt weighed heavily on him whenever he had to sit down at the piano in front of her. It wasn't that Jamal didn't love playing the piano, it was the one place where he truly felt at home. He could lose himself in the music, forgetting about the harsh stares, the whispers, and the assumptions people made about him. But in Mrs. Henderson's class, there was always that underlying tension. He never knew what to expect from her. Would she give him a chance, or would she brush him off as just another student who didn't measure up? The weeks following that afternoon in the music room were filled with an odd mixture of emotions for Jamal. On one hand, he felt a sense of quiet pride. He had played well, and Mrs. Henderson had even acknowledged his talent. But on the other hand, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was still something unresolved. The class had gone on as usual, and though the other students seemed to treat him a bit differently, he still couldn't help but feel the weight of Mrs. Henderson's judgment hanging over him. The days after Jamal's conversation with Mrs. Henderson felt different. He didn't know how to explain it, but everything seemed to have shifted. The tension he had felt for so long, that constant fear of being judged for his talent, began to fade. It wasn't that everything was perfect now, there were still challenges, still moments when he felt out of place. But he no longer felt like he was fighting an invisible battle. For the first time, he felt like he had control over his own destiny. Jamal began to notice the change in the way people looked at him. The whispers from his classmates had stopped, replaced by nods of respect and curiosity. It wasn't just about the piano anymore. It was about how Jamal carried himself. He walked a little taller, spoke a little more confidently, and it was clear that others were starting to take notice. He spent more time in the music room, practicing for hours on end. The piano had become his escape, his refuge. It was the one place where he could express himself without fear, without hesitation. There were days when the music flowed so naturally that Jamal lost track of time, his fingers moving almost instinctively across the keys. But there were also days when he struggled, when the notes didn't sound right, and when the music felt distant. Still, he kept going, determined to improve. One afternoon, after a long practice session, Jamal left the music room to find a note taped to his locker. It was from Mrs. Henderson. He had no idea what to expect. Was this going to be another awkward interaction, or was she finally going to acknowledge his progress? He quickly opened the note, and his eyes widened as he read the simple message, "Jamal, I've heard you play a few more times lately. Your progress is impressive. Keep it up. There's a recital coming up, and I think you should be part of it. Don't miss this chance to share your gift." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. A recital? He hadn't even considered the idea of performing in front of the whole school. The thought terrified him, but at the same time, it excited him. This was what he had been waiting for. This was his opportunity to prove to everyone, especially Mrs. Henderson, that he belonged in the world of music. But the fear was still there. What if he messed up? What if his performance wasn't good enough? What if the students who had once doubted him were right all along? These questions rattled in his mind, but deep down, Jamal knew that he couldn't let fear hold him back. This was his chance to show everyone, including himself, that he had what it took to succeed. He began preparing for the recital with a renewed sense of focus. He chose the same piece he had played that day for Mrs. Henderson, the one that felt so personal to him. It was a piece that had always given him a sense of peace, but now, it felt like it had a new purpose. Jamal practiced every day, sometimes for hours, perfecting each note, refining each passage. As the recital date approached, Jamal felt the pressure building. The thought of performing in front of so many people, including his classmates and teachers, made his palms sweat. But every time he sat down at the piano, he reminded himself of something Mrs. Henderson had said: "Don't waste that talent." It became his mantra. No matter how nervous he felt, no matter how unsure he was, he reminded himself that this was his gift, and he couldn't waste it. He had something special, something that couldn't be ignored. The night of the recital arrived, and Jamal stood backstage, feeling a mix of excitement and dread. He could hear the distant chatter of the audience and the soft murmur of the performers before him. His heart raced as he stood in the shadows, waiting for his turn. He had no idea how he had gotten here, standing on the edge of something so big. But here he was, ready to face his fears. When his name was finally called, Jamal took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The spotlight hit him, and for a moment, he felt like he couldn't breathe. The room was filled with faces: his classmates, teachers, even some parents waiting for him to play. It was the kind of attention he had always avoided. But tonight, he wasn't going to hide. Tonight, he was going to stand tall. Jamal sat at the piano, his hands shaking slightly as he placed them on the keys. The room fell silent, and he could feel the weight of everyone's expectations. He closed his eyes for a moment, blocking out the world around him, and began to play. The first few notes were shaky, but as he continued, the music began to flow more freely. Jamal could feel the tension in his body easing, and the familiar comfort of the piano took over. He wasn't playing for anyone else. He was playing for himself. Each note he played carried a piece of his soul, each chord a reflection of his journey, his struggles, his doubts, and his triumphs. As the piece reached its climax, Jamal felt a sense of release, as if all the weight he had been carrying for so long was finally lifting. The music poured out of him effortlessly, and for the first time, he felt truly at peace. There was no fear, no doubt. There was only the music. When he finished, the silence in the room felt deafening. Jamal slowly opened his eyes, unsure of what to expect. But then, the sound of clapping filled the air. It was slow at first, but then it grew louder, more enthusiastic. Jamal looked out at the audience, his heart swelling with pride. He had done it. He had faced his fear and performed in front of everyone. And he had done it with everything he had. As he stood there, taking in the applause, his eyes landed on Mrs. Henderson. She was standing near the back of the room, clapping along with the others. But there was something different in her gaze, something that made Jamal feel like he had truly earned her respect. She had always been the one who doubted him, but tonight, it was clear that she had seen him for who he really was. After the recital, Mrs. Henderson approached him backstage, a small smile on her face. "I knew you had it in you," she said, her voice warm. "You were incredible tonight, Jamal." Jamal smiled, his chest swelling with a mixture of relief and pride. "Thank you," he said, his voice shaking slightly. You don't need my approval anymore, she continued. You've proven yourself. Just remember, don't let anyone or anything stop you from reaching your full potential. Jamal nodded, his heart full. He had made it. He had faced his fears, and in doing so, he had proven that he was more than just the boy others had underestimated. He was a musician, and no one could take that away from him. As Jamal walked off the stage that night, he felt like he was finally free. The weight of doubt had lifted, and for the first time in his life, he knew that he could go anywhere, do anything. And it all started with the music. It wasn't that she had said anything cruel after that day, she hadn't. But there was a cold distance between them, a wall that Jamal wasn't sure how to break through. Every time he saw her, she seemed to look at him with a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty, as if she couldn't quite figure him out. It was as though she was waiting for him to mess up, waiting for him to fall short of the expectations she had for him. Jamal kept telling himself not to care. It was hard, though. He had never been one to seek validation from others, but Mrs. Henderson's words had lingered in his mind. Don't waste that talent. It wasn't the kind of advice he had expected from her, and it had left him questioning everything he had ever believed about his abilities. Could he really make something of himself in music? Could he prove that he wasn't just another student who would fade into the background? The pressure started to build, and it wasn't just coming from Mrs. Henderson anymore. His classmates were talking about him more, whispering about his performance in the music room. Some were impressed, others seemed skeptical, but most of them were just curious. They wanted to know how he had done it, how a kid who had always kept to himself could suddenly play the piano like that. The attention wasn't something Jamal had ever wanted. He had always preferred to stay in the background, hidden behind his music. But now, he found himself at the center of conversations he hadn't asked for. One afternoon, Jamal found himself in the school hallway, heading to his next class. As he passed the music room, he noticed the door was slightly open. He hesitated for a moment before walking inside. The room was empty, save for a few students sitting in the back, chatting quietly. But Jamal wasn't interested in them. He was drawn to the piano. He sat down at the keys, his fingers instinctively resting on the familiar black and white keys. For a few moments, he did nothing but sit there, letting his mind clear. The room was quiet, and for once, he didn't feel any pressure. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't trying to prove anything. He just wanted to play. Jamal began to play a soft, slow melody, letting the music fill the air. It was a piece he had been working on for a while, something that felt personal to him. He poured all his feelings into the notes, allowing the music to express what he couldn't say with words. It was like a weight lifted off his shoulders as he played, as though the piano was his escape from everything he couldn't control. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Jamal looked up, startled. Mrs. Henderson was standing in the doorway again, watching him closely. Her arms were crossed, but there was no harshness in her gaze. It wasn't judgment, nor was it the cold indifference he had seen in her eyes before. This time, there was something softer in her expression. Curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe something like understanding. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Jamal stopped playing, unsure of what to do. Mrs. Henderson was the last person he expected to be in the room, especially after everything that had happened. He felt exposed, vulnerable, but he wasn't sure why. He had nothing to hide. The music was his truth. Mrs. Henderson took a step inside, closing the door gently behind her. "I've been hearing a lot about you lately," she said, her voice calm but serious. Jamal didn't know how to respond. Was this going to be another lecture? Another comment about how his talent would never go anywhere? Or was she going to mock him again for thinking he could make something of himself in music? He forced himself to speak, though his voice trembled slightly. I don't know what you mean, he said, trying to keep his tone neutral. I mean your playing, she said, glancing at the piano. People have been talking about it. Your performance that day, it caught everyone off guard. Including me. Jamal didn't know what to say. He had always tried to keep his head down, never drawing too much attention to himself. But now, it seemed like everyone was watching him. It was a lot to handle, especially when it came from someone like Mrs. Henderson. You've got a gift, Jamal, she continued, her voice quieter now. I've seen a lot of students come through this class, but there's something different about the way you play. You don't just follow the notes. You make them come to life. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. Was she really saying this? Mrs. Henderson, the teacher who had always made him feel small, was complimenting him. It was hard to believe, but there was no mistaking the sincerity in her voice. Thank you, Jamal said softly, feeling a rush of emotion he couldn't quite place. Mrs. Henderson took another step forward, her eyes locking with his. I know you've had a rough time, she said, her voice gentle but firm. People like to make assumptions about others, and I've been guilty of it too. But you've proven me wrong. I should have seen your potential a long time ago. Jamal felt a lump form in his throat. He wasn't sure how to respond to that. Mrs. Henderson had never been kind to him before. She had always treated him like he was just another student who would eventually fade into the background. But now, she was acknowledging him, truly acknowledging him as someone who had something to offer. It was more than he had ever hoped for. I didn't expect this from you, he said, his voice barely a whisper. I know, Mrs. Henderson replied, her gaze softening. But sometimes, it takes someone to show you a different side of yourself. You're not just the kid who sits in the back of the class. You're someone with real talent, Jamal. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. For the first time, Jamal felt like Mrs. Henderson wasn't just the strict, cold teacher he had always seen her as. There was something more to her, something human. Maybe, just maybe, she wasn't the person he thought she was. As Mrs. Henderson turned to leave, she paused at the door. I'm looking forward to hearing more from you, Jamal. Don't stop playing. Jamal sat there in silence for a moment, letting her words sink in. It wasn't the praise he had been hoping for, nor was it the validation he had been searching for. But it was something better. It was respect. And that was something he had never expected to receive from someone like Mrs. Henderson. As he resumed playing, Jamal felt something shift inside him. He was no longer playing to prove a point to anyone. He was playing because it was who he was. And for the first time, it felt like he was being seen for the person he truly was. The day had started like any other. Mrs. Henderson was going through the usual lesson, and the class was being quiet, paying attention, just as they were supposed to. Jamal sat in his usual spot, his fingers tapping lightly against the desk. Music was always in his head, and he couldn't help it. The sound of the piano in his mind was always playing, even when there was no piano in front of him. Jamal walked back to his seat, his heart still racing. The room was quiet, so quiet that he could hear his own breathing. It was a strange feeling, like the whole world had paused for just a second. But then the murmur of whispers started, and Jamal's stomach twisted. He knew he had surprised everyone, but he wasn't sure if it was a good surprise. The days following Jamal's performance in Mrs. Henderson's class were a blur. On the surface, things seemed to go back to normal. He attended his classes, did his homework, and sat with his friends at lunch. But deep down, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Something big had happened, but he wasn't sure what it meant yet. Every time he walked past Mrs. Henderson's classroom, he felt a mix of unease and curiosity. She had barely acknowledged his performance after that day, and he was starting to wonder if she had simply dismissed it. What if she thought it was a fluke? What if she didn't truly believe in his talent? At the same time, Jamal couldn't ignore the small, nagging feeling that something in the air had shifted. It wasn't just the way his classmates had looked at him after he played. It was the way some of the other teachers had begun to treat him, too. There was an almost unspoken recognition of his ability. He could feel their eyes on him sometimes, and while some were encouraging, others seemed to avoid his gaze altogether, as if they were trying to process what had just happened in Mrs. Henderson's class. The next time Jamal saw Mrs. Henderson, it was in the hallway between classes. She was standing with a few other teachers, talking and laughing, but when she saw Jamal, her expression froze for a split second. She quickly looked away, but not before Jamal caught the glint of something in her eyes, something like surprise, maybe even respect. But that was all. There were no words, no congratulations, no acknowledgement of what he had done. It was as if nothing had changed, and that made Jamal feel even more uncertain. He had expected something, maybe a small compliment, or at least a hint of recognition for his talent. But all he got was her avoiding him like she was trying to pretend the whole thing never happened. The rest of the week passed in much the same way. Jamal continued to play the piano during his free time, his fingers dancing across the keys with the kind of confidence he had never felt before. He knew now that he had something special, something no one could take away from him. But that didn't mean it was easy. There were still moments when doubt crept in. One afternoon, after school, Jamal was walking to the music room when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "Hey, Jamal, you playing today?" It was Marcus, one of his friends from class. Marcus was always the first to offer encouragement, and he had been one of the few people who truly understood Jamal's passion for music. "Yeah," Jamal replied, giving him a small smile. "I'm gonna practice for a bit. I've got a new piece I'm working on." Marcus grinned. "Cool. Maybe one day you'll play for the whole school. You're that good." Jamal chuckled, though it was more of a nervous laugh. "Maybe," he said, but he wasn't sure if he believed it. He had always kept his talent private, only sharing it with a few close friends. The idea of performing in front of the whole school was both thrilling and terrifying. Could he do it? Could he stand on a stage and perform for an audience, especially one that might include Mrs. Henderson? "Well, you better get to work then," Marcus teased, patting Jamal on the back. "Catch you later." Jamal nodded, and as Marcus walked away, he felt a new surge of determination. Marcus believed in him. Maybe it was time to believe in himself, too. He reached the music room, and as he entered, the familiar sight of the piano gave him a sense of calm. This was his place. This was where he could truly be himself. He sat down, closed his eyes for a moment, and began to play. The notes flowed out of him as if the piano were an extension of his soul. The music filled the room, and for those precious minutes, everything else faded away. But as Jamal played, he heard a sound at the door. He looked up, surprised to see Mrs. Henderson standing there. She was leaning against the door frame, watching him intently. Her arms were crossed, and her expression was hard to read. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. He had no idea how long she had been there, but he knew this wasn't like the time in class. This was different. Mrs. Henderson was here, in the music room, watching him play like she was trying to figure him out. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Jamal's fingers hesitated on the keys, but he forced himself to continue playing. He wasn't sure why, but he wanted to show her that this wasn't just some fluke. This was who he was. This was his passion. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Henderson spoke. "You've improved," she said, her voice surprisingly soft. Jamal paused, unsure if he had heard her correctly. Mrs. Henderson? Complimenting him? "Thanks," Jamal said, his voice barely above a whisper. He wasn't sure how to respond. Was this a trick? Was she mocking him again? Mrs. Henderson took a step into the room, her gaze fixed on him. "I didn't expect it," she said, almost reluctantly. "But you've got something, Jamal." Jamal didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to ask her what she really meant. Did she really think he had talent, or was she just trying to smooth things over? But something told him that the truth was somewhere in her eyes. Maybe she wasn't as cold as he had thought. Maybe she had been so focused on keeping up the walls that she hadn't realized how much she had underestimated him. "Well, I appreciate that," Jamal said, his confidence growing just a little. For the first time, Jamal saw Mrs. Henderson in a different light. She wasn't just the stern, distant teacher he had always feared. There was something more to her, maybe even some kind of respect, though it was still hard to tell. "I'll leave you to it," Mrs. Henderson said, turning to leave. "Just, don't waste that talent." As she walked out, Jamal sat there, stunned. He had expected nothing from her, and yet, in that moment, it felt like she had given him something valuable. Maybe it wasn't an apology, but it was close enough. Jamal took a deep breath and played a few more notes. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like he was finally on the right path. The piano was more than just an instrument, it was a part of who he was. And no matter what Mrs. Henderson or anyone else thought, he was going to keep playing. Because for Jamal, the music was everything. He kept his head down, avoiding the gazes of his classmates. He could feel their eyes on him, some filled with admiration, others filled with something else. He didn't know if it was sympathy or curiosity, but he didn't care. All that mattered was that he had played his heart out. For the first time in a long while, Jamal felt something he hadn't felt before: pride. But Mrs. Henderson didn't break the silence. She didn't clap like some of the other teachers would have. She didn't even smile or give him a nod of approval. Instead, she just stood there, frozen behind her desk. Her face was unreadable, and for a moment, Jamal thought she was going to say something cutting. Maybe she would make some excuse about how he was lucky to have gotten through the song without messing up. Maybe she would make him feel small, as she always did. Instead, there was just a long, uncomfortable silence. The class continued to whisper among themselves, and Jamal felt his nerves return. His fingers still tingled from playing the piano, but the pride he had felt earlier quickly began to fade. What if Mrs. Henderson didn't say anything because she was disappointed? What if she was angry that he had actually played well, that he had defied her expectations? After what felt like an eternity, Mrs. Henderson finally spoke, but her voice was different. It wasn't the stern, demanding voice she used in class. It was quieter, almost uncertain. "Well, that was unexpected," she said. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. Unexpected wasn't exactly a compliment, was it? He had played with everything he had, and now Mrs. Henderson seemed almost annoyed by it. He glanced at the other students, but they were all looking at her, waiting for some kind of verdict. It felt like everyone was waiting for Mrs. Henderson to say something, anything that would either validate his performance or tear it down. Jamal knew she was the one who held the power in that moment. Mrs. Henderson cleared her throat, trying to regain her usual composure. "Well," she said again, her voice a little sharper, "let's move on. We have a lesson to finish." She quickly turned to the chalkboard, dismissing the moment as if it had never happened. Jamal didn't know what to think. Her words felt cold, but there was something else in her eyes. He couldn't put his finger on it, but there was a flicker of something, a hint of surprise or maybe even respect. It was hard to say, but Jamal wasn't sure he wanted to try and figure it out. He had done what he came to do. The rest of the class continued, but Jamal couldn't focus. His mind kept going back to the piano, to the way he had played, to the silence that followed. Was it enough? Had Mrs. Henderson truly heard him? Or had she just been going through the motions? As the lesson dragged on, Jamal felt like an outsider again. His classmates seemed to carry on as if nothing had changed, but he knew that something had shifted. His fingers were still itching for the piano keys, but he was afraid. Afraid that if he played again, it would all crumble. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of class, Jamal packed up his things in a daze. He walked out of the classroom without looking back, his head held low. The hallway was bustling with students, but Jamal felt completely alone. He didn't know where to go next. He could head to the music room and practice some more, but the thought of facing Mrs. Henderson again made his stomach churn. What if she had just been mocking him the whole time? What if his performance hadn't been enough to change her mind? Later that day, as Jamal sat in the lunchroom, he tried to push the thoughts out of his head. He sat at a table with a few of his friends, but his mind kept wandering back to the piano and the awkward silence in Mrs. Henderson's class. His friends tried to talk to him, but it was hard to focus. They were all so normal, so carefree. They didn't know what it felt like to have your talent underestimated, to have people look at you and think you could never be good enough because of where you came from or the color of your skin. Jamal pushed his food around on his tray, barely tasting it. He wanted to talk about what had happened earlier, but part of him was afraid. What if his friends didn't understand? What if they thought he was making a big deal out of nothing? His mind kept drifting back to Mrs. Henderson's words. Unexpected. It was clear she had never expected him to play so well. It was clear she had thought he was just some kid with no real potential. But Jamal knew that he had more to offer than she realized. Later that afternoon, Jamal found himself in the music room, standing in front of the piano once again. He took a deep breath, his hands resting on the cool keys. He felt a strange sense of calm now, a determination that had been missing before. The piano had always been his escape, and now, it was his way of proving something not just to Mrs. Henderson, but to himself. He started playing again, this time with a different kind of focus. He wasn't trying to impress anyone. He wasn't playing for anyone's approval. He was playing because it was what he loved. The music filled the room, and for a moment, Jamal forgot about everything else, the whispers, the stares, and the doubts. All that mattered was the music. As the notes floated through the air, Jamal's mind cleared, and he realized something important. He didn't need anyone's approval to be great. He didn't need Mrs. Henderson's approval. All he needed was his own belief in himself. The rest would follow. But then, Mrs. Henderson did something Jamal hadn't expected. She turned to him and, with a sly smile, said, "Jamal, I'd like to hear you play something for the class today." The room went silent. Jamal's stomach dropped. He looked around at the other students, their faces filled with curiosity. Some of them were genuinely interested, while others seemed eager to see him fail. Jamal's heart began to race. He wasn't sure if this was a test or if Mrs. Henderson had some other motive. The way she said it didn't sound like a simple request. It sounded more like a challenge. He didn't want to play. Not today. Not in front of everyone. But he also knew that backing out would only make things worse. So, Jamal stood up slowly, his hands trembling as he made his way to the piano. Every step felt like it was dragging him deeper into a pit. He tried to calm his breathing, but the nervousness was overwhelming. He had played in front of others before, but this felt different. The pressure was suffocating. It wasn't just the usual performance anxiety, it was the fear that this moment could change everything. Jamal sat at the piano, his hands hovering over the keys for a moment. He closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and tried to center himself. He needed to block out the faces staring at him. He needed to block out Mrs. Henderson's cold gaze. He needed to forget about the whispers and the assumptions. He decided to play a piece he had learned a long time ago. It was one of his favorites, something that always brought him peace. As his fingers touched the keys, a wave of calm washed over him. He was lost in the music, and for a few precious moments, nothing else mattered. The melody flowed from his fingers, each note resonating through the room, filling the space with something beautiful. But even as he played, he couldn't help but feel the weight of Mrs. Henderson's eyes on him. He could feel the judgment, even though she wasn't saying anything. Her expression was unreadable, but Jamal knew there was more to her silence than just listening. It was as if she was waiting for him to mess up, for him to falter in front of the class and give her a reason to say, "I told you so." Jamal pushed those thoughts out of his mind and focused even harder on the piano. He didn't care what Mrs. Henderson thought anymore. He didn't care what the other students thought. All that mattered was the music. He let his fingers move freely, expressing everything he had ever wanted to say but couldn't. It was as if the piano was the only place where he truly felt heard. But as the final note played, Jamal opened his eyes and saw the entire class staring at him. He had played with all his heart, and now there was nothing left to hide. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. The room was heavy with expectation, but Jamal wasn't sure what they were waiting for. Was he supposed to feel embarrassed? Was he supposed to look at Mrs. Henderson for some kind of approval? Jamal didn't know what to expect, but he didn't have to wait long to find out. Mrs. Henderson, who had been so confident moments earlier, stood frozen. Her eyes were wide, her mouth slightly open as if she had been caught off guard. It was as though Jamal had done the impossible. He had shocked her into silence. For a brief moment, it felt like the world stopped. Mrs. Henderson didn't say anything, but the class began to stir. Whispers filled the room, and Jamal could feel their eyes on him, but it wasn't the kind of gaze he was used to. This time, it wasn't filled with judgment or doubt. It was filled with respect. It was as if they were seeing him for the first time. Jamal couldn't help but feel a rush of emotion. He had done it. He had played the piano not just for the class but for himself. And in that moment, something inside him shifted. No matter what Mrs. Henderson thought, no matter what anyone else thought, Jamal knew one thing for sure: he had proven that his talent was real, and nothing could take that away from him.